Hello and welcome to the Jo's Art History Podcast, a podcast which celebrates all things art historical every single day. Welcome back. I can't quite believe how quickly we seem to be flying through these episodes, but yes, even more importantly, it is my first International Women's Day podcast special. Very, very excited. Although if you are listening to this, I'm releasing this on the 9th of March. I am fully aware that International Women's Day is the 8th of March, but I always publish on a Tuesday. So actually 2022, I'll be bang on the money. So just stick around for that. Also, if anyone's interested, I will always remember when International Women's Day is because the 8th of March is also my birthday. So I have this really special thing where when people wish me happy birthday, I get to say, thank you, happy International Women's Day. So it's a really lovely thing. Don't feel bad that you didn't know, but next year, as well as International Women's Day, there really should be some sort of fanfare in and around my birthday. I'm of course kidding. Anyway, really excited to welcome you back to the podcast this week for, as I've said, my first International Women's Day special. We are talking about the amazing Anna Atkins. First and foremost, have you ever heard of her? Probably not, but I can guarantee you will definitely not forget who Anna is after listening to this incredible chat that I have with photographer and photographic artist Josie Purcell. Josie is based in Cornwall, and as well as being a photographer, she also runs Cornwall's only mobile darkroom called Shutterpod. She runs lots of workshops on photography processes, including the cyanotype, and has a real passion for historical photographic techniques and processes. And she is fabulous throughout this chat in diving down into how you create a cyanotype, why Anna is so important, and really a kind of call to action to create, really. It's a really inspiring chat, and what I love about talking to people like Josie, her passion and her love of the topic is just so genuine and just brilliant throughout. A brilliant chat. As well as this, in the spirit of Anna and International Women's Day and celebrating brilliant women, if you're listening to this on the 9th of March 2020, I am running a competition on my Instagram account to win a make your own cyanotype kit, if you will. There's different ways that you can make it, but you can buy specially treated paper, and I'm offering someone the chance to win their own sort of DIY cyanotype printing kit via sort of packaged, specially treated paper, just to encourage people to get creative, but also in the spirit of Anna, just celebrating brilliant women who were pioneers and really pushed forward important ideas and have made very important contributions to science and arts, but have kind of fallen by the wayside because of history. That's a huge topic in itself and definitely up for a different podcast discussion. Anyway, Anna Atkins is the first person ever, not just the first woman, the first person ever to create a book of photographic prints using a process known as cyanotype printing. And in this conversation, Josie and I really dig down deep into what cyanotypes are, the processes, how Anna used them, why it's important, why we should celebrate the fact that Anna has done this. And it's a really interesting chat about a fabulous woman who, although people know her, she really isn't sort of talked about enough, in my opinion. And I had never heard her, so I have to thank Josie first and foremost for introducing me to the incredible world that is Anna Atkins. A word of warning before we continue. You may remember in a few podcasts that the audio has this terrible habit of overlapping each other as we speak. And it sounds like we're talking over each other. And this happens in a couple of places throughout the podcast. I promise you, this isn't what happened in real life. This is just for some reason when I export the audio from the platform that I use to record, it seems to compress it in certain places and it sounds like we're talking over each other. So I'm really sorry, particularly right at the end. I'm very sorry, but it only happens for a few seconds every time. But it, comfort of listening isn't what I would want it to be. Despite that, however, it's an incredible chat. Josie is so passionate, not only about Anna Atkins, but about the cyanotype printing process. And yeah, it's just brilliant. It's a great chat. I loved it. And I really hope you do too. So sit back and relax as Josie and I discuss Anna Atkins and the cyanotype process. Josie, today we're going to be talking about this incredible woman, Anna Atkins, and I have to thank you first and foremost. She was never on my radar, and I don't think if you hadn't written into me, she probably would have completely surpassed me. And I'm really grateful first and foremost that you've brought this incredible woman to my attention. But can I ask, where did you first come across Anna?
Oh gosh, quite a number of years back now. My background is working in photography, lots of different sort of options, medical photographer, commercial photographer. But in the past sort of 10, 15 years, I really went back to sort of my first love of traditional darkroom processes and alternative photographic processes. So those tend to be processes that might be made without a camera even. So that's where I really sort of found out about Anna Atkins because of my passion for one of those processes, which is the cyanotype.
And what is the cyanotype for anyone that's perhaps never heard that term before?
Well, hopefully there's a slight clue in the name in the sense that it's a process that produces blue and white images at the end of it. And it's a sort of a photogram process, a contact printing process. It was invented back in 1842, and Anna was one of the, well, in fact, she's noted as being the first person to create a photographic book. And it was with that process that she created that book. So yes, so it's a really fascinating process, and for me it's really important because it's probably one of the least sort of impact on the environment, as in you can wash an image out in the ocean, for instance. So that's sort of my interest in it as well. It speaks to sort of trying to lessen my photographic footprint as well. So yeah, so it's a really beautiful process. It's one that can be used really simply. You can, but it's not a one-trick pony. There's so many different things that you can do with it and ways of using it. And it's been really fascinating actually, because although it was never going to be, because of just the two tones, it was never going to be taken on in sort of the history of photography when it was being invented and developed. It really is such a beautiful process that in the last sort of, since I've really been working with it again, I've really known in the last few years that quite a lot of people are getting really interested in it. You can use it with children, you can, so it's got so much scope really as a lovely process that you can do at home, and it's such a simple process in its very basic form as well.
I think that's what's really intriguing for me about the process of producing these. And the first time that I came across it actually, so by day I work in a sculpture gallery, and it was one of our artists that had created a couple of prints using the process, and I had never ever heard of it before. It's so fascinating. But I think first and foremost, really, let's kind of talk about Anna.
Yeah.
And who was Anna Atkins and why is she important?
Well, for me, back in the era that Anna lived, and she was born in 1799 and she died in 1871, so sort of Victorian period. And it was obviously a period when there was an awful lot of invention and discovery and research across numerous scientific fields happening. Photography itself was invented and developed during that period. Photography as we know it now was invented and at that time. But I think for me with Anna, it was because women in particular at that time were not necessarily considered, sort of, science wasn't really considered a suitable pastime for them to take part in. So for me, having women in a position where they could actually push the boundaries and rock the boat of everyday life, then obviously she came from a wealthy and a privileged background. So although women as a whole had less opportunities, she did obviously have a slightly better opportunity than other women, in the sense that her father was a scientist, and he really encouraged her education and shared his knowledge with her when she was a child. Her mother died not long after she was born. So I think that they became quite a strong partnership, as it were. And she grew up with a passion for science and a passion for botany in particular. So she was actually a botanist and also an artist as well. One of the things she did for her father, he translated a book and she illustrated it, which was all about shells. So she was very good at drawing beautiful illustrations as well. So she had all of those interests and that passion. But it wasn't until when she was a little bit older that she discovered the cyanotype process and had the opportunity to actually share her collection. She'd been collecting numerous plants, flowers, seaweed, lichen in a herbarium over the years, and it wasn't until she made this discovery with a family friend around the cyanotype process that she was able to then share this on a bigger scale.
And you said that she was incredibly privileged, which I think is a really important thing to point out. She was, her father was a scientist, like you said. She was encouraged to learn and pursue her passions, but also her husband as well was very well connected, and it was kind of them together that they became friends with the gentleman that invented the sort of photographic process.
Yeah, so she married in 1825, and John Pelly Atkins, and yes, he was a wealthy merchant. They went to live in London, and that's where her father also worked in the natural history department of the British Museum. Her father and her husband were friends with Henry Fox Talbot. He is one of the earliest sort of inventors of photography, photogenic drawing and calotypes, etc. So she was really well connected in that sort of area. And actually in 1841, even before she found out about the cyanotype process, she was given a camera. So she is potentially considered one of the first women to take photographs, although none of her photographic work actually survived. So we can't. Yeah,
that was going to be my next question.
Yeah, apparently I think some people have said that Constance Talbot would have actually possibly been the first woman, obviously within the Talbot family, but because none of her work apparently survives either, I don't think that's something that we might ever know, who came first, and I guess it doesn't really matter, but yeah, so she was really interested in the whole topic of painting with light, drawing with light, etc. So she had that connection through William Henry Fox Talbot, but it was actually another family friend, Sir John Herschel, who actually invented the cyanotype process in 1842. So yes, it was that connection, that family connection, that enabled her to learn more about that process.
So as well as the family connections as well, she was, her dad was part of different scientific societies, and I think Anna herself was part of a female society as well, where a female sort of botanist society.
Yes, she was granted membership of the Royal Botanic Society of London. I think that was in about 1839, and that was really one of the only places then that women were allowed. Because who knows what who knows what we would have got up to if we'd been allowed in other places back then. But anyway, yeah, that was one of the places that was allowed. I guess I don't know this for a fact, but I imagine it's because in the sort of Victorian era, scrapbooking plants and flowers, having herbariums and botany was considered this okay pastime for women to have an interest in. So possibly more, not to say that take anything away from botany as a science and a topic, but I guess maybe that's why they allowed women in, whereas the others didn't, and had stricter sort of rules about who could be involved. But her father did at least share all his knowledge from his fellowship of the Royal Society. So he would go to lectures and share papers with us and include her. And I think at one point she may have been allowed into some of the meetings. So, her father was a huge influence on her, and they had a really good bond there. So I guess in that way, having a father who wanted her to achieve and follow her passion was an absolute benefit for her to be able to go on and make these cyanotypes in the future.
Yeah, well, that's it exactly. It really is incredible when you think about it. This is a time when really a woman's job was to be a mother and a housewife and not to be sort of gallivanting, if you will, and
Yeah.
having conversations with
Yes.
scientists and also sort of contributing to science and art in any sort of way. What I love though is I read this thing that was talking about, like you just said there, her dad was brilliant at sort of sharing his knowledge and encouraging her. But what I really love is these conversations were happening about, the development of photography and these different types of exposure and documentation of how it could benefit botanists and not just botany, science in general, and these developments. But it took Anna, a woman, to be the first one to actually be like, okay, I'm going
Yes.
to try this and see what
Well,
happens.
absolutely. I mean, I think from sort of the age of 20 or so, and growing up, I guess, as well, but definitely from the age of 20, in her 20s, she'd started this collection of finding seaweeds and plants and lichens and all ferns, etc. So she'd built up this herbarium over these years. The thought of having to illustrate all of this to be able to share it with people was quite daunting. I think I've read that she had over 1,500 seaweed specimens, just the seaweed element of her collection. So you can imagine her scratching her head and thinking, I'm never going to be able to draw all of these. And I think also what she was really sort of craving was not just sort of how on earth could you ever draw all of this and to be able to share it with people easily and readily, but the detail of a way of sort of being able to replicate the detail and capture that detail as well. Um, so when she obviously learned from Sir John Herschel about the cyanotype process and saw it in action, I guess that was her light bulb moment really for fantastic. This is now my way of being able to show people and share all these findings and all this sort of knowledge from this collection so that other botanists, other science could look at it and learn from it. And also, I guess, just appreciate its beauty for what it is as well.
Well, that's it. And these are incredibly beautiful, detailed studies, images, photographs. I mean, there's so many things that they fall under, but I think it's really important to reiterate that, just like you said, if she didn't use this process before this was invented, you had to physically
Yeah,
illustrate everything. And when I was reading for this, and I read this sentence where someone was like, because before this, there was you had illustrators, and when I was at university, we looked at James Cook's Voyages of Discovery in the
yeah,
South Pacific, and it was very common that any sort of big voyage that you took a voyage
yeah,
artist, and because they were essentially the person that illustrated what the botanists and the scientists that also went on these
absolutely.
explorations. And it's like you said, it's incredibly laborious, it's so time consuming. And also another question I have is, where on earth did she get seaweed in London, which is a complete
Yeah.
curveball
I
thought.
guess I mean I really don't know for sure, but she lived sort of and grew up in Kent, and I presume that she sort of travelled to the coast, or perhaps worked with others who were collecting. I mean, I really don't know for sure how she actually laid her hands on all of these amazing specimens, to build up this huge collection that she had. I like to sort of imagine her, going off to the seaside and maybe tucking some sort of seaside samples under a skirt or something. I don't really know,
Yeah.
but I don't really know for sure. But I'm just really glad that she did, and that she was able to share, sort of a not fate, but just sort of circumstances collided and brought her to the cyanotype process, so that she was able to share it. And I think it's sort of talking about sort of how she sort of collected and this connection to nature as well. And I think because the process just uses these two chemicals that when mixed together they become light sensitive. You can place your items on top of treated paper or another surface, expose them in sunlight and rinse them with water, fix the image with water. So it's such a lovely, simple way of almost sort of connecting back, I guess, almost to the, particularly like with the seaweed, it's come out of the sea, it's been, it's at the ocean, on the shoreline, all of that, and you're working in a way that actually is kind, I guess, in a way to sort of the items you're using. I mean, obviously they're still chemicals, but yeah, so it's just that beautiful sort of a connection back to the natural items, and that I really like as well. But I think if anyone ever makes a cyanotype, or if anyone listens to this and think, oh, I'm going to give it a go, I mean, even now, even though I've actually made hundreds of them, it's still it's still an exciting, beautiful sort of moment when you create something this way. And I can imagine back then, sort of her being able to see all these different flora that she had, sort of just magically appearing in front of her eyes in such detail. And I think that's what obviously inspired her to go, this is the way for me to share all of my botanical specimens with a wider audience. And it was her 1843. So the process was invented in 1842, and it was in 1843 that she produced her first book, Photographs of British Algae, Cyanotype Impressions. I mean, every time she produced a volume, she had to do it from scratch. She couldn't she couldn't just scan it and print another copy out. So a lot of work, a lot of dedication, I think, to getting what she'd done out there. So absolutely fabulous. And I know, I believe her father was very supportive of this, obviously, and sent on copies of these volumes that she'd made to British Museum, Kew Gardens, lots of other scientists, Royal Society. So helped really share what she'd made.
Yeah, and what is incredible, and I think people at home need to understand, is when we're talking about the cyanotype process, like you said, that she had to go back and redo them. Every time you make a cyanotype, it's a unique impression,
Absolutely.
is it not?
Even if you're using, I would say, even if you can obviously use specimens, so leaves, people, what, because of Anna, I think, and one of the beautiful, and even now, is when people make cyanotypes with ferns. I mean, if you go on Pinterest or do a Google search, and you will no doubt discover that one of the first things people do is try and make a cyanotype with a fern. It's still a beautiful image, and obviously why it's so people are drawn to ferns, I think, in particular. But even if you use found objects like that from nature, or a pair of scissors, for instance. Someone, I can't remember his name, I feel so bad now, but some beautiful images that were made with old cassette tapes with the tape pulled out.
Oh, lovely.
Or negatives. You can actually use negatives. I mean, I would always say that you don't use original negatives if you can sort of scan and print out digital negatives. So you can use negatives to actually make these contact prints as well. But invariably, you could say each one is unique, because when you expose it, the amount of time you expose it, the way the paper's been coated, so many different things will actually have a slightly different impact on the result. So you might be using the same negative, but if you're making an original print every time, it will be slightly different from the other one in some form or other. I mean, there might be people who love cyanotypes and are very, very, perhaps a bit more stricter than I am, who might dispute me. But I think overall, yes, each one is going to have a difference in some way or another.
Yeah, and for just to again hit home when we're saying, she had to make these, the unique things. She had to, every time she made a copy of her first book, which she then proceeded to make one volume, then became 3 volumes. But in the first volume alone, she has over 400
I know, it is
cyanotypes.
absolutely crazy. And I just I think it was over about 10 years. So she sort of did the first book, the algae book, And I always wonder if I say that right, because some people say algae, don't they? Anyway, I'm digressing.
I was worried that I would say cyanotype incorrect, or so don't
Yeah,
worry.
so yeah, so that was first, and she went on in sort of the next 10 years. I think in by 1853 she'd made another volume for British and foreign ferns, and also in 1854 another one for British and foreign flowering plants and ferns, which she made with her friend called Anne Dixon. Um, so I think over that sort of 10-year period, she was pretty busy, sort of creating these volumes of different specimens that she wanted to share. But I think one of the interesting things that I really like is apparently she signed them um, AA, so just with her initials. And then after her death, I don't know how long after her death, but apparently after her death, it was decided that AA stood for anonymous author. So it wasn't until later that I think whoever twigged, someone obviously twigged and thought, no, this is Anna Atkins' work. This is not an anonymous author. Yeah, so I think she's quite fortunate not to have, as often with I guess again talking about sort of women in science and history and perhaps in other fields as well, can often be sort of overtaken or ignored or forgotten. So it's really nice that she hasn't been forgotten for that. And I really like the fact as well that she is seen and as the first person really to make a photo book. And photo books are beautiful and absolutely wonderful to look at. So her being sort of the first, and all that time and effort that she put into creating it is wonderful. I did want to tell you actually about another woman photographer at the sort of around the same sort of periods.
Oh, that's brilliant, actually, because I was going to say, did she inspire any women, or is there anyone who was
This
active at the
woman
time that
was
she
probably a little
knew?
bit later than Anna and was actually using photography in a way that wasn't really the norm back then. So most of a sort of photography as we come to know it in the Victorian era, when people were taking portraits, for instance, were very formal and very, you had to hold still because obviously the exposure times, etc. So this woman wasn't working that way. She really went for sort of very candid, short exposure photographs, and her name was Mary Dillwyn, and she lived in Wales. And I really liked interested in her, and I only got to know about her recently myself, actually. And she's apparently noted as being the first photographer to actually capture a smile, and a
Really?
proper sort of natural smile, a candid smile, and then the first to capture a snowman on print, and also the first person to have one of her photographs photobombed. That was a
No.
photo of her because she basically, again, and very fortunate, privileged background, but she documented life on the estate where she was growing up, so took photographs of family members, life on the estate, that sort of thing. And I think this photograph, possibly off the top of my head, maybe sisters or cousins or something like that. And in the background, there's like a little face peering over their shoulders that obviously wasn't meant to be in the photograph. So yeah, that's so I really liked her. And she's even Mary Dillwyn, even I think she's perhaps beaten Anna with this. She actually now has a pub named after them in Swansea. So that's yeah, the first woman photographer to have a
Oh,
pub named
brilliant.
after her. I'm not sure how many other women photographers will ever get that, but we'll
That's great. Surely there's got to be
maybe
one named
there
after
is
Anna.
somewhere, or maybe there should be. Maybe that's what we when we can all start
Oh,
going back out and
yeah.
about, hopefully, maybe we should open an Anna Atkins establishment.
That's great. So I'll set up the crowdfunding
And
page,
everything
and
inside will have to obviously be blue and white.
of course, otherwise we're not true to
Yes,
Anna or
absolutely.
botanical themed.
Yes.
Definitely near the sea, and enough of being inside. We definitely, yeah, much really looking forward to when life
Yeah.
gets back to normal a bit, and we can, yeah, normal things that we all
Yes.
love but very much took for granted. Oh, I can't wait to have a look at Mary Dillwyn. This is incredible. I did have a few questions for you. So you said there that Mary was one of the first women to use sort of short exposure times. And when I was researching this, and of course, if you don't know the answer to this, that's absolutely fine. When I was researching the cyanotype, apparently the Victorians used to use it for to make postcards, but it was of images of people. So for me, I kind of have to ask, how does that work? If I mean,
It
would
would
they
have
have
had
used
to,
a
yeah,
negative of a
some sort of way,
photograph,
I guess, a
or
negative
I
of a
mean,
photograph, or whether they actually used. I mean, with I don't know. I don't know 100%. I wouldn't be able to say exactly, but obviously a negative is one of those options. They would have perhaps created a negative because I think with cyanotype process, to be honest, although it didn't take off in popularity in the long term for sort of photographic purposes,
hmm,
it did go on to basically be when if you've heard of the name blueprint. That's the cyanotype process. So blueprints were made, I think, up until about the 1950s using the cyanotype process. So yes, if there was a negative you could use and place on top of it, that would have been a way of doing it. You can also anything that I guess is can let light through. So you can even sort of draw on paper, and you can oil the paper, um, or you can print now. You could print an image on just sort of printing paper, and you can oil paper and lay that on top, and that can work as well. So there might have been a few different ways that they might have made those postcards with people, but I imagine it would probably be through some sort
hmm.
of glass plate negative or something like that that they were using, depending on the time of that the images were made. Um, yeah, I'll have to look at those.
Yeah. I mean, my thinking is maybe, but this is only because I was speaking to someone about Vermeer the other day, and because
Ah,
there's a debate going that
okay.
he used a camera obscura. So I
Yeah,
wondered, is
I
that
guess so.
something that
Yeah,
the
they could
Victorians
have. I mean,
could have used?
if you use a camera obscura and sort of put the exposed paper, I don't really know how because it's almost sort of a real size, isn't it? I guess they could have. I'm going to have to investigate this
Mm,
myself. This is a fascinating part of cyanotypes I don't even really know that much about. There's the sort of the Victorian postcard side of things. So thank you.
I think this is a great example of why art and art history and having conversations like this are so brilliant, because you can always learn something, and you can always, it sparks such an interesting
Yeah,
conversation, and then you take yourself down a rabbit hole, because I'm definitely like to see if camera obscuras were popular
yeah.
when, in the Victorian age. So this is when you wrote to say, oh, would you be interested in hearing about Anna Atkins, and I read a bit about her, I was like, yes, why is she not more commonly known? Because something I wanted to say, just to go back a little bit, like you said, her she is considered the first woman to have published a book of photography, a photography
Mm,
book. And I googled the phrase, who what was the first photography book, and it comes up as Anna
yeah.
Atkins. So it's just an amazing thing, and the whole idea of using it as for a blueprint as well, which I think is fabulous. And then it just, again, that clicked in my head. I was like, of course it was a cyanotype. It's blue, like blueprint. It just,
Yeah.
like, penny drops,
Yeah,
mind
I think
blowing
I mean it's
moments.
got sort of quite over the years. I think cyanotype's got lots of different names. Obviously, the blueprint. People refer to it as Prussian blue because of obviously the colours and what have you. So it does, some people talk to it as talk about it as a photograms and shadowgrams and sort of the different contact printing processes have different are given different names and terms. Um, but yeah, it is just it's a fascinating one, and I've actually very quickly just had a quick search on these Victorian cyanotype postcards. So I'm quite interested in this now, and I shall be doing some more digging in this. This is very exciting.
One I found was a woman standing by some sort of like trestle in a garden, and I was like, oh, and then so that's kind of the only one that I've seen so far, and I was like, oh gosh, I wonder how they achieved that. But anyway, yeah, and also another thing to point out is why cyanotype was used instead of
Oh
photography. It
gosh,
was
yeah,
because it
yeah,
was much,
absolutely.
much
I
cheaper.
mean, even now, you know, if you can, if you want to give it a go, you can buy pre-coated paper, which is very inexpensive. So you can have a go and not feel, you know, worried about sort of the costs of, like you say, film or materials. Um, I think because with photography, as sort of standard photography, let's call it, um, we're very fortunate now with digital, with smartphones, that you know you can safely create an image or take an image and retake it or etc. Um, but I tend to still work with film on occasion too, and sort of knowing on a 120 roll film I've got 12 shots really does sort of and so you are more conscious of the cost when
Yeah.
when you're working in sort of more traditional photographic mediums. But definitely the cyanotype, I think, is one of those mediums that is one of the safest for people to try on their own, is one of the cheapest still. I you know, when you coat paper, it goes such a long way that a very small amount of the mixed chemicals, you know, you can sort of create 50 odd sort of images from a very small bottle of the solution. So yes, absolutely. And obviously even
Mm.
back then, I guess maybe because, you know, it does take, it's not just a case of stick it on the solution and it will be brilliant. You might want to do lots of different exposure times. Sometimes the images disappear, sometimes there's no detail, there's lots of technical reasons why that might be happening, etc. But because the cost is pretty minimal, if you're, you know, if you're going to either use the pre-coated
Mm.
papers or buy your own chemicals in bulk, particularly in bulk, then yeah, absolutely a cost-effective way of getting creative. So I imagine back then, with the amount of items that Anna had in her collection, having a more cost-effective process, even then, was a benefit to her, because I imagine she probably had to potentially make you know, a few different exposures to get the correct one that she used in the actual finished, you know, product.
Yeah, and I think what's really intriguing for me is that you don't need a dark room for this type of
Yeah,
photography, because it is a sort of,
absolutely.
you
You,
know,
I mean,
branch of
I tend
photography.
to work. I'm not very good as a photographer, as my own practice. I'm not very good at. I love science. But I'm not very good at the sort of the stricter elements, shall we say? So I tend to work in a slightly freer way. So I don't note everything down that I do necessarily.
But I think that's the whole idea of, you know, the freedom of artistic practice and why that is so important. Okay, rules are great, and you know, following instructions, but
Yeah.
there's also, it's also great sometimes if you sort of steer off the garden path, if you will, and that's when actually a lot of really interesting things can happen
Absolutely.
in
And I
art.
think with
And
Anna's work is instrumental in helping with science and sharing knowledge, certainly at the time, and is, you know, a lasting testament to what she'd done. But the cyanotype process isn't just about, you know, necessarily laying something on top of the solution and that's it. So you can use it on different mediums as well. So things like you can use it on, you can obviously coat paper, but you can coat fabric, any sort of natural fabric, so a linen, a cotton, that sort of material, even on wood. People can have used it on glass. So there's lots of different options for cyanotype on what medium you use it on. And also there's different ways you can use it. You can create something called wet cyanotype, where people will mix almost like a washing up solution with it, or spray it with vinegars, or use different salts to get different effects. I mean, I tend to make a lot of mine originally. One of my series, I would make along the shoreline. So you can take it sort of in situ with you and make it on site. And yes, the fact that you say you don't need a dark room, you don't need to be locked away in a dark room. It's almost a sunroom in a sense rather than a dark room, because it reacts quite slowly. The actual light sensitive solution will react relatively slowly, so you've got a bit of leeway when you're even creating the image on your medium. So yeah, it's just really good fun. And if I just absolutely love it. It's just, there's so many different ways you can go with it, and there's some really lovely contemporary artists as well working now that have really used it in a beautiful way. If I can just give them a mention, one of them is Megan Ripe. I hope I've said her name correctly. And she's been making these beautiful large-scale cyanotypes that are made in the sea with the ocean. So really worth looking her up. And another sort of contemporary artist that I really loved the work of was a woman called Leah Halloran. I think I've said that right. And again, her body of work using the cyanotype process goes back to relating to female astronomers. So that's another beautiful way of sort of those connections back to history and where the cyanotype came from, and the fact that it's still women who are using the process. And yeah, I don't know, it's just a really fascinating part of photography and a beautiful process. So yeah, love it.
Yeah, well, the artist that I came across who sort of introduced me to the whole cyanotype was a female sculptor called Bryony Marshall, and she actually used to be a scientist and then had a bit of a change of heart and then decided that she wanted to train as a sculptor, and that's what she uses her cyanotypes for. So she makes, in particular, one, she looks at sort of cells and the sort of the development of the body, and one of them she uses it in what's called the Carnegie stages. So when essentially what scientists use to describe the growing of an embryo and a baby, and there's like 23 stages, and she makes models of each stage and uses cyanotype in some of the processes to prints, because in some of the stages they kind of look like masks,
that
or they
is
look like
amazing. That sounds
sculptures.
fantastic.
It's
I'm
really
definitely
interesting.
gonna look her up. It is just wonderful how people can use it and so effectively, and yet such a lovely simple process to to be able to do that with. That sounds fantastic. There is another artist, and I feel so bad because I've forgotten her name now, but she made beautiful fabric animals out of it, sort of deers and wildlife, and another artist who made fabric card butterflies and then connected them all along sort of walls and outside spaces. Just beautiful, nice. The things you can do. So hopefully this might inspire some of your listeners to give it a go. That's what I'm hoping anyway.
Well, absolutely. And like you said, I think earlier when I had a look, the solutions were only about maybe like £15 when I had a look earlier. Maybe you can get them maybe they were like the cheapest version, or maybe you can get cheaper still. But I was like, wow, that's really not very expensive. But I have to ask you, so I'm currently looking at your work here. It's called Golden Fern, which is beautiful. And one of the things that we've talked about cyanotype, it's blue and white. But in some of your cyanotypes on your website, there's some colours through them.
This now lives with my friend in Italy. She's got the original, so I can only see it myself on my screen now. I treated her to it. But that one is with turmeric. So you can use spices, you can use you can use lots of different sort of condiments, as it were, I guess. Your store cupboard can also help sort of and I know that with this one it would have been this one I believe was also sprayed with a vinegar solution, so you can get the sort of so you can sort of throw salts at it. They tend to sort of make very nice, so you can make really like stars almost with if you used that process. But yeah, that one was the sort of the colour, the slight sort of golden colour in that one. Yeah, was made with turmeric.
This is I can see us ending this conversation and me spending the rest of my Saturday like researching and buying. But I am definitely going to give this a go, brilliant. Josie, and I'm going to send you the results.
Absolutely, do give it a go. And there's lots of I mean, I will just say, obviously, it's still 2 chemicals, so if you're mixing it up at home from powder form or chemical form, just have a quick look at sort of some safety guides. And it's not I always would probably put some gloves and a face mask on, which I guess we've all got now anyway, but just for safety purposes, I always like people to be on the safe side rather than it's not, I wouldn't say they're dangerous chemicals, but I think with any chemicals you have to be just be sensible with it. If you're not buying it ready made up, and then that's easier to just paint on directly.
Oh, Josie, I could talk to you about this for hours and hours and hours. And thank you so much for coming on and talking about Anna and the cyanotype process. You said that Anna was an influence in your work and that you really love working with
Yeah.
historical photographic processes.
This sort of goes back to my interest in sort of environmental matters and ties in with that. Is I use now, I tend to use obviously cyanotype, but I tend to use anthotypes, which is where you create images just using the juice, as it were, of berries and plants, flowers, vegetables, that sort of thing. And the other sort of process I use is what I call unfixed lumens. So a lumen print is made using, people tend to say expired, older black and white photographic paper. And it's the same contact printing type of process. So you expose it in sunlight, so you don't use it in a dark room. But rather than fix it using photographic chemicals, although you can sort of make saltwater fixer, but that's another story. So instead of fixing it, I then simply scan and then work on a computer. But I think it's always, however we work now, particularly in relation to sort of trying to minimise your impact on the environment, i.e. what you're putting down the sink and down the drains and going into watercourses, and making sure, we're not just swilling loads of photographic chemicals that we use at home down the kitchen sink, because it's just not safe or right for the environment. So for me, it really sort of all of those processes are trying where I can to minimise that. But there is always a compromise, because even if I'm working on my computer or talking to you via a smartphone, there has been an impact on the earth at some point. And so it's all about sort of compromise. And for me, just trying to work in a way that can make so I can still be creative, but sort of do it in a way that hopefully is slightly more sustainable, or potentially having a little bit less impact. But that's such a huge discussion, and so much I think to unpick there. So the main thing is to sort of if you're interested in the cyanotype, give it a go and have some fun.
Oh, I love that. Before I let you go, I've taken up far too much of your time already. I do have one final question for you, and it's quite a big question, so you can take this as wide or as sort of personal to you as you want. But it is the Joe's Art History podcast, after all. My question to you is, why is art important?
I just think for everyone, wherever you live, wherever your background, whatever your interests are, your life has been impacted by art, even if you don't know it. And I think it's just keeping it alive, the fascinating things that you can find out when you look back that can influence the future. I still think it's almost like, I think I sort of described it, maybe I described it to you, I'm not sure, but I always feel like sort of people are sing from the past and it comes down the line still to now. So art history for me is just it's not something that's a dead thing. It's still alive and it's still influencing art now, and in all art forms. Or even if you don't consider something an art form, it can be influencing, like, I don't know, say for instance an advertising campaign might have been influenced by something from sort of I can't think, a Monet painting or something. Do you know what I mean? So it's all those that interconnected, and the opportunity, I guess, to learn from looking back and inspire what you do looking forward, I guess.
I love that. Thank you. Oh, I love asking people that question, because I just get such varied responses, but at the heart of it, it's just art is still alive and it's such an important part of every day. And thank you so much. That was answered beautifully. Josie, before you go, where can people find you and connect with you and see some of your lovely work?
My website, And if they just search for josiepurcellphotography.com, they should hopefully find me.
Amazing. Josie, thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you and learn so much about Anna Atkins
it. I
and
hope
the
I've
cyanotype.
done justice
so
for
thank you
you
so
on
much.
your show, and also to Anna Atkins. And yeah, hopefully I've got my my art history facts okay.
Absolutely. No, you were brilliant. And there you have it, another episode of the Jo's Art History podcast. Once again, thank you so much to Josie for coming on and talking about not only Anna Atkins, but really giving us a deep dive into the cyanotype process, as well as giving us an insight into other historical photographic processes as well. Really interesting. And I really loved this chat. I learned so much. And if you are feeling inspired to go and create your own cyanotypes, I would thoroughly encourage you to do so. As I said in the introduction, that I myself have given this a little whirl, and it's so fun, it's so easy to do, and yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing everyone's creations. Please do feel free to share them with me, or if you just want to get in touch and discuss anything that you heard today on the podcast, you can email me, joesarthistory@gmail.com, or you can contact me via Instagram, which is @joesarthistory. My DMs are always open, and it's always lovely to hear from people who are enjoying the podcast, who have learnt something, or who have gone off and discovered things as well. So please also feel free to share recommendations of different topics that you would like to hear on the podcast. I would happily answer and do a few listeners' requests. Maybe we'll do that in a few weeks' time. As always, you can view the images which we discussed today via my Instagram page @joesarthistory. You can also find them on my website, www.joesarthistory.com, or you can watch the podcast via my YouTube channel. If you search Jo's Art History in YouTube, you'll find my channel, and all my podcasts have a little video, and it's just another way of interacting with people. Also, if you're hard of hearing, you can listen along with subtitles. It's important to be inclusive. The links to Josie's website and her Instagram page, which wasn't mentioned in the discussion, I will link below in the show notes as always, as well as some other important links, such as the link to Anna Atkins' first photographic book on British algae, which is really beautiful and definitely something that you should check out. It's really incredible to think that she's done over 400 individual prints for one of these volumes. It blows my mind every time. Finally, I have been Jo McLaughlin, your host and resident art historian on the Jo's Art History podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to welcoming you next time on the podcast. Until next time, keep learning, and remember, art is for all. And for one final time, happy International Women's Day.